My name is Mike Iaconelli. I'm 49 years old. I'm from Pittsgrove, New Jersey, and I'm a professional bass fisherman.
Crowd going nuts for tri-state angler Mike Iaconelli. Are we going to see a lot of this? Absolutely. The crowds in Philadelphia are a thing to behold.
The origin, how it all started. How did I get into this this mess here? Man, how far back do you want me to start? Maybe I'll start at the beginning. I was born in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. I was born into a very working class family from South Philadelphia. Grew up in a neighborhood that was predominantly Italian and Polish and a little bit of Dutch and German and city environment, you know? And, you know, I can tell you that some of my earliest memories of when we lived in Philadelphia, the house revolved around family. And, you know, just some like little blips in my mind of my uncle, my grandfather, my mom, my grandmom, visits from aunts and uncles and cousins. They're probably my earliest memories. You know, growing up at that early age in Philadelphia, there wasn't a lot of water, but the water that was there was thriving. So we had the tidal Delaware River, we had the Schuylkill River, we had FDR Park, we had Wissahickon Creek, and in fact, the first picture I ever saw of myself fishing, and I can't remember this, but it's crazy to look at this picture. It's me at probably 2 or 3 years old holding a trout that I can't remember if I caught it or my uncle caught it, but I'm holding this trout at Wissahickon Creek, which is a creek that runs through Fairmount Park in Philadelphia. And, you know, from an early age, it was something that I thought was normal, right? You know, the interesting thing is, living in Philadelphia at that time, nobody fished. Fishing was not a thing. But at that age, you know, it just felt normal and natural, and it felt like something that we did. You know, the other thing growing up that I think I just didn't know any better is my dad died when I was 2, and I have no memory of him outside of pictures. I don't have memories of his passing or a funeral or any of that. And you know, when I think back to it, I'm like, why don't I have an empty spot, or why don't I remember any of that? You know, from a very early age, my uncle Don, who lived with me, was very much my father figure. So it never felt like a void for me, you know, at that early stage of my life. The other thing that's important to talk about is, I think, the normalcy of a family living together in this part of the world, right? Whether it's Philadelphia or New York City. You know, for me and a lot of city urban dwellers, you know, that have strong family ties, it's a very normal thing to live with your mom and your dad till you're 30, or to live with your mom, your uncle, your grandparents. You know, it's just a very normal thing. And, you know, it's like a Northeast thing to stay home, you know? And, you know, a big trip is going 3 hours from the house in the car. You know, it's very much a neighborhood, a family unit. And that's what I remember from the early part of my childhood. We lived in Philadelphia till I was 6, and then we made a big family move to the burbs, to the suburbs, to New Jersey. And it was a big deal. And I do have some early memories of this, especially coming from, my grandfather. My grandfather was born in Philadelphia, was raised in Philadelphia, worked in Philadelphia. But at my grandfather's core, and by the way, my grandfather, we called him Pop. And at Pop's core, he loved the outdoors. He loved being outside. He loved fishing. He loved gardening. And when you're in the city, that's a really hard thing to do. When you're in a row home and you've got, a backyard that's concrete, that's, 10 by 20. So I remember, I was six and a half. I remember this move being a really big deal for the family, especially for my grandfather. And we literally moved across the Walt Whitman Bridge, 2 towns over, to a town called Runnymede. And we moved into a house that I guess you would technically call it it's like a country, like a craftsman style home is what it would be called. But it was in suburbia. The interesting thing is that on our block where we moved, we were the only house that actually had a yard, a big yard. Most of the other ones had really small yards. But this was a craftsman style house that had a yard that was probably half an acre. And it was a dream come true for the family, especially my grandfather. That was a good segue for me to really start having more memories. And I really, 6, 7 years old after we made that move, I really have these memories of not just that house, but our family vacations every year. And, now that I'm talking about it, looking back on it, this was a critical part of my falling in love with fishing, right? Of my passion for the sport. Every year we would take a family vacation, and we'd split those vacations up. Some years we were in the Pocono Mountains. Some years we were down the Jersey Shore. But I always remember these week-long summer vacations. And the thing I remember is that all we did was fish. And again, it seems so normal to me that when you go on a vacation, my uncle and my mom, my grandfather, working class people, they finally get a week of vacation. They go on vacation and they fish the entire week. I'm not talking about a fishing trip once in 5 days. I mean, every day we fished. And that's really where my fishing memories start to kick in. And, they were unbelievable early childhood experiences for me. We used rental boats. We never owned a boat. We rented boats in the Poconos, and we'd put on the back. We had a Sears Game Fisher trolling motor. And I remember that because I remember the color. I could close my eyes and see this green, like an old green head to the trolling motor. And we'd hook it up to a die-hard battery. And at the time, we felt like we were flying, because up to that point, I remember my grandfather and my uncle rowing, old school rowing to go fishing. And now we had this trolling motor and went like 20-pound thrust, probably went like a mile an hour. But, we fished out of rental boats. Rental boats down the shore, Jersey Shore, Ocean City, Wildwood, that had, 9.9s and 15s on the back that were falling apart. And what I remember is fishing for anything that bit. And, looking back on that, what a great way to get started in the sport, right? There was no pressure and no tactics and no high-dollared equipment. It was fishing at its core, right? Which is dropping a line, waiting for a bite, hook reeling a fish, setting the hook, reeling a fish, and landing the fish, right? That is fishing at its core. And I got to experience that. And, you know, when we were fishing for anything that bit, in the Poconos and freshwater, it was trout, it was stock trout, it was bluegill, panfish species, it was perch, it was crappie, it was catfish, occasionally a pickerel, but it was never bass, never. I don't ever remember catching a bass in those early days. In saltwater, it was flounder, it was weekies, it was snapper blues, with a ton of junk fish thrown in there, sea robins, oyster crackers, all that stuff. And, you know, the interesting thing is all those early days, for the most part, was all live bait fishing. You know, it was squid and fathead minnows in the back bay. It was night crawlers and, believe it or not, corn, actually regular corn, grocery store corn for the trout, occasionally shiners, but it was all basic fishing. But when I close my eyes, man, I can remember some of those early trips, and through pictures, I can really get a glimpse that, you know, my uncle and my grandfather and my grandma and my mom, my aunts and uncles, because they loved to fish, they were grooming me to love to fish, right? They were putting me in an environment where I was having fun, and the challenge of getting that bite and learning how to keep pressure and land the fish, and the reward that came with landing a fish, that really started the early roots of me falling in love with the sport. You know, my memories of that early fishing continue up until probably when I was about 10 or 11 years old. And then sort of like these other new memories start to kick in. And I was real fortunate that when we made that move to the suburbs of Jersey, I ended up in a town, ended up in Runnymede, another neighborhood where I started to bump into some friends at school who also liked to fish. You know, 5th, 6th grade, realizing that there were other people that actually liked to do what I did, which is fish. It was a big thing. And, you know, specifically there were 3 guys, Brian Stockel, Dave Brodzik, Tom Hernishin, all in my same grade, all from Runnymede. And, you know, as I started to meet these guys and realize that they like to fish, it created a common bond. So, you know, my memories then shift to, you know, now we're in Jersey, and I really remember us bonding over this thing called fishing that we liked. And, you know, Brian was from a household with a single mom, right? His dad wasn't in the picture, very similar to me. Dave Brodzik, growing up in a household with a single mom, very similar to me. And, you know, even Tom, growing up with just, you know, one sister and a dad that worked a lot, you know, we were really the same kind of people, and we loved to fish. So, you know, I can remember, you know, us even at 10 or 11 going on these fishing trips in town, you know, walking to and riding our bikes to Timber Creek in Runnymede, to a little lake called Hirsch's Lake, right in the town of Runnymede, and, you know, gone fishing. And it was such a simple time back then, because, you know, you got to remember there were no cell phones, there were no Ubers, there was no internet. You know, our moms weren't worried about us getting kidnapped. It was a safer time. I have a lot of fond memories of that. But there's a moment that happened that really, really changed my life. And I remember being at my friend Tom's house, Tom Hernishen's house. And he lived on the other side of the pike, still Runnymede, but he lived on the other side of the pike. And I was at his house one day, and I remember his dad came home. And as me and Tom were talking, I can't remember exactly what we were doing. I remember Tom's dad saying, "Here, guys, here's some old fishing magazines." And he gave me a couple, and he gave Tom a couple. And I looked at these magazines, and they were called Bassmaster Magazine. I vividly remember it, and I remember going home with a few issues. You know, to put it in perspective, this was like 82, 81, 82, 83, early 80s. And I remember going home and looking at these magazines for the first time and seeing this thing called competitive bass fishing. It was the single most eye-opening thing I'd ever read about fishing up to that point. I've read fishing magazines. I knew about In Fisherman. I knew about Outdoor Life. I knew about some outdoor publications. But this magazine was competitive bass fishing. Dude, my eyes popped open. I think I read those issues cover to cover like 1,000 times. But it really started to open my eyes up to bass fishing. Not fishing for anything that bit, but targeting bass and looking at these guys that actually made a living bass fishing. It seemed so absurd and ridiculous, but appealing at the same time, right? I'm a kid. I'm 10, 11 years old, and you know, a good analogy might be, you know, other 10 or 11-year-olds that look at a baseball star or a football star or basketball athlete, and they aspire to do that one day. I think that's, you know, my mind was starting on that at that age. Really took that and ran with it, you know, and literally that summer, on that summer's family vacation, whatever year that was, 81, 82, 83, right around there, I remember going on that trip to the Poconos that year and going there saying, I want to target bass. I want to target bass, not with a worm or not with trolling or dropping an anchor and still fishing, but with an artificial lure, casting and retrieving. I remember thinking on that trip, that's my goal. But, you know, up to that point, I had no real bass tackle. I had a rod that I used for everything, and I knew how to hook on a night crawler, and I knew how to trout fish. I knew how to troll like a spinner, an inline spinner. But outside of that, I had no knowledge about anything at all. But I remember that in my grandfather's tackle box, he had some artificial lures. The problem with this on this trip, and I remember all this like it was yesterday, was that my grandfather, Pop, was very particular about his stuff, his fishing stuff. And I specifically remember that at that age, Pop's box was always off limits. And you know, his box was, I guess, a very typical box for the 70s or 80s, which was this 3-tier old hip roof. We used to call them hip roof style boxes. And when you opened it, as you opened the box, you opened this brass latch. And as you opened the box, 3 trays emerged, one on top of each other. And it was, you know, at that age for me, that was like the holy grail, right, of fishing. I remember waking up, I think it was the first morning, like super early. And the cabin we rented was on a lake in the Poconos called Fairview Lake. And on this lakefront cabin, and there were like 3, 4 cabins on the property, so it wasn't just us, but they had a dock that went out probably about 10 foot, and then at the end of the dock, it teed out in the two ends, a right and a left end. And so I remember sneaking out on the porch of this cabin and opening up Pop's box, like, you know, quiet, like make sure Pop doesn't know. And I remember seeing some lures in there. And the first one I grabbed was this bait that to me just looked like a minnow. Had no idea what it was. It had 2 treble hooks on it. It had a clear plastic little lip on it. And I remember taking this bait and literally like sneaking down the dock with it and getting to the end of the dock. You know, literally I still had a split shot on my line to a barrel swivel to a snelled eagle claw number 8 hook, bait hook. And I remember thinking, man, what do I do with this thing, right? And I knew it a little bit. So I took off the split shot, I undid the snap, and I took the snelled hook off and I put this lure on. And I'm like, wow, just looking at it, it was all like very fascinating. And I got to the end of the dock and I remember casting this thing out. And I remember, you know, watching this bait that I've never thrown before, like hit the water and it just plopped. And I remember like looking at it, like not really knowing what to do except just reel it. And you know, as I started to reel this lure in, the water was clear. Fairview Lake's a clean Pocono lake. I remember watching this minnow bait just sort of coming in, very rhythmic, left and right, left and right. And I remember saying to myself, like, oh my God, like this lure looks real. This actually like looks like a minnow. And I remember stopping it. And I watched and the lure just floated back up to the top. And when it floated back up, you know, it was almost like time stopped for a second. I was watching that lure and there were sort of like rings that were, you know, gone away from it as it popped back to the surface. And I remember thinking like, wow, like this is cool. Like how magical it is that there's this lure that looks like something alive. And then before I knew it, there was an explosion on the lure. You know, I remember like almost being scared of this boil, this sound, this eruption at the bait, like almost shocked. And before I knew it, I didn't even set the hook. Before I knew it, I've got something pulling back. It was the shortest, longest fight of my life up to that point. You got to remember, I pretty much caught trout and panfish and little flounder up to this point, right? And this fight was incredible. And the fish is diving and jumping and trying to throw the lure. And I remember being so excited. I literally reeled the fish up to the rod tip. Like it hit the tip of the rod and I swung it over the dock and landed it. I was so excited. I didn't even know how to hold it. I didn't know anything. But I remember running down the dock and like screaming like, ah, you know, because it was big. It was a 2.5 pounder at the time, which was a giant for me. And I remember running down to the cabin and screaming, and everybody came out. They thought I was hurt. They thought I was dying. And it was this 2.5 pound bass. I remember, you know, everyone being excited, but mad and worried and proud and all at the same time, right? I remember my grandfather was mad because I stole the lure, but he was proud of me because I have this fish that he's going to eat probably at the time. But that was probably the most important fish I ever caught in my life. And I remember like it was yesterday. I remember it. And, you know, if I can pinpoint it to one fish that sort of changed my life, it was that bass.
Heard you had a bad day, it ain't going your way, yeah. Never give up. Heard my life was a movie, I got people trying to use me. I will never give up. It's not about where you at, it's about where you headed. And all the things they say about you only heard if you let it. I gotta put on for the kids, cause they getting the message. I'm on my knees thanking God, look at all of my blessings. Look at little old me doing real big things from a real small town. I'ma make them all proud. And these kids need a leader, I'ma show them all how. Anybody in my way, then we gon' mow them all down. Hey, from the Garden State, I got some deep roots. Fisherman drip with some new boots. I almost didn't make it, that's the real truth. They call me the general, I got real juice. Pull up in a Bass Cat doing donuts. When I'm at the classic, the people go nuts. Heard you had a bad day, it ain't going your way, yeah. Never give up. Heard my life was a movie, I got people trying to use me. I will never give up.
You know, from that moment on, from that fish on, I became obsessed with bass fishing.